Good evening, everyone. My name is 𝘾𝙣𝙠 𝙒𝙚𝙣, curator at the 𝙒𝙬𝙗 Museum of Contemporary Art. Welcome to our 10th and final session in the When We See Us webinar series titled Refusing the Gaze, Seeing and Authoring Ourselves, a culmination of an evocative, discursive programming series inspired by the landmark survey exhibition, When We See Us, A Century of Black Figuration in Painting. The exhibition was on at 𝙒𝙗𝙗 from 15 November 2022 until 3 September 2023. In 2024, the exhibition will travel to Kunstmuseum Basel in Switzerland. The webinar series are conceived by 𝙒𝙗𝙗 in collaboration with the Institute for Humanities in Africa, 𝘞𝘡, at the University of Cape Town, UCT. Our esteemed speakers for today are Raphael Chikukwa, Sean Jacobs, and Renée Mboya. I will read their brief bios as a way of introduction. Raphael Chikukwa is the Executive Director of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe. Born in Zimbabwe, Chikukwa holds a postgraduate diploma in Arts and Culture Management from the University of Witwatersrand Business School and an MA in Curating Contemporary Design from Kingston University, which he attained as a Chevening Scholar. Chikukwa is a Museum of Modern Art MoMA International Curatorial Institute Center for Curatorial Leadership CCL 2021 Fellow. Chikukwa joined the National Gallery of Zimbabwe in 2010 as its Chief Curator and is now the Executive Director and Chief Curator of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe. Before joining the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, Chikukwa worked for over 10 years as an independent curator. Chikukwa is the founding curator of the Pavilion of Zimbabwe at the Venice Biennale, starting from the 54th up to the 58th edition. He is committed to a multitude of committees, among them Highline Plinth in New York, 2020, DAAD, German Academy Exchange Service, the Delphina Foundation, London, UK, the Future Generation Art Prize, and has served as juror for the Dakar Biennale in 2018. Chikukwa has been on various international panels that includes Art Basel Hong Kong Conversations in 2019, Art Basel Miami, USA 2008, and the Joburg Art Fair. He has contributed to a number of publications that include a newly published African Art Reframed Reflections and Dialogue on Museum Culture by the University of Illinois Press, USA. Maonero Umbono, Insights in Zimbabwean Culture, Contemporary Art, Zimbabwe, Zimbabwean Pavilion Catalogs, among them Seeing Ourselves 2011, 𝘠𝙁𝙗 2013, Pixels of Ubuntu UNU 2015, Deconstructing Boundaries 2017, Sokorisnam Soro, A Tale Without a Head 2019, Kabokamuala, Migration and Mobility Exhibition 2016, to name a few. His qualifications and international experience earned his position at the National Institution, which he hopes to change the visual arts landscape of Zimbabwe. The second Johannesburg Biennale in 1997 provided an impetus to Raphael Chikukwa's curatorial career. After working as a volunteer guide for the Biennale under the watchful eye of the late 𝘱𝘰𝘥𝘢𝘆. He later moved back to his home country, Zimbabwe, as a process of relocation to his motherland. Some of the major exhibitions he curated include Haifa Harare International Festival of the Arts, 2000 up to 2004, Lime Transmission Commonwealth Exhibition in Manchester, 2004, Visions of Zimbabwe at the Manchester City Art Gallery and African Heroes in 2006 at the Imperial War Museum North. Chikukwa is a founding staff member of the Puma-funded Creative Africa Network as an editor and advisor of the project from 2008 to 2009. Sean Jacobs holds a PhD in politics from the University of London and an MA in political science from Northwestern University. He is an associate professor of international affairs at the New School in New York City, and publisher of Africa is a Country, which he founded in 2009. Africa is a Country launched the careers of several young African and diaspora writers, scholars, and artists. It features online commentary, original writing, media criticism, videos, audio, and photography, becoming one of the leading intellectual voices in the African online media sphere. The writer 𝘱𝙧𝙗𝙗 described it as basically the inside of my head. Jacob's book, Media in Post-Apartheid South Africa, Post-Colonial Politics in the Age of Globalization, was published in 2019 by Indiana University Press and the Wits University Press. Renée Akitelek Mboya is a writer, curator, and filmmaker. Her custom is one that relies on biography and storytelling as a form of research and production. Renée is presently preoccupied with looking and speaking about images and the ways in which they are produced, but especially how they've come to play a critical role as evidence of white paranoia and as aesthetic idioms of racial violence. Renée works between Kigali and Nairobi and is a collaborative editor with the 𝘬𝘬𝘺𝙁 collective. I'll now hand over to Renée, who is our moderator for this session. Thank you.
Thank you, 𝘚𝙗𝙣, for this rousing introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here with Sean and Chikukwa and to think better around this exhibition, When We See Us, as Koyo has said, a historical continuum of Black portraiture. And existing within this artistic genealogy, I think, challenges us all to think about what this kind of work might do and how we might reproduce these practices and these learnings in the various institutions that we're a part of. In that respect, I very much situate myself within the genealogy of the National Museum, the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, and Africa as a Country as institutions that I have had the privilege to learn from, and institutions that I am constantly citing from. And I think one of the most important things that in the last year that I've seen spoken about within the context of this exhibition, When We See Us, is the ways in which 𝘚𝙗𝙣 and Koyo have spoken about the trans-temporality of this exhibition. And I think in this discussion, we'll see evidence of that as well in looking at the opening of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe in 1957, for example, and the initiatives that they perform today. And in the same way that Africa is a Country has been building a reference. I think these forms are replicated in the exhibition when we trace the lineages that are presented by the various artists, from Sherry Samba to Salim Mulingea. I think one thing that I wanted to mention as we begin this discussion is the role that memory work has played in post-colonial Africa and the ways in which it has often followed the imperial formula of remembrance, that we prioritize national days of commemoration, the building of public monuments, museums, exhibitions, and school curricula, for example. And these all fall within the remit of aligning citizens with a perceived, agreed upon values in remembering the past. And these forms of transmission in many respects create a state memory that situates the citizen's identity within its sovereign sense of heritage, as belonging to iconic state symbols and ideas. And I think the examples that we're going to look at today very much challenge this governing mythology, whereby a transitional state decides which past is to be remembered, when it can be remembered, when it can be voiced, and what materials are constituted as acceptable, valid forms of representation. And given this perpetuation of the colonial condition, I think it's important for us to advocate for a process of historical inquiry in which one stops transferring ways of knowing from imperial structures into post-colonial spaces. I think in many ways, this discussion and this exhibition has been a process of unlearning as a mechanism to complicate the go-to forms of evidence that are used to describe experiences or identities as fixed facts or evidence. Yeah, so I'm very aware that we have limited time today. So I think if we can move directly into the presentations and hopefully have more time for questions towards the end. Thank you.
Who's going to go first?
You can, Sean.
I can go. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Thanks for inviting me to the museum and to Thandazani and Renee and Raphael. Thanks for being in conversation. And I'm speaking. I want to just make I'll make a couple of quick points because I know we're pressed for time. So but before I do it, I want to make a kind of disclaimer, which is that I'm speaking here more in my capacity as a media scholar, somebody whose background is more in political science and who's more interested in the intersection of politics and popular culture. I'm also speaking, of course, from my vantage point in the United States. So I'm bound to be influenced by debates and discourses that happen here, even though as much as I would try I think I try very hard, and particularly the work of Africa as a Country has tried to create a balance between the sort of discourses that circulate in the diaspora and those that circulate on the continent, or even those that circulate in the more powerful countries in Africa, because, you know, we can't pretend that there aren't these imbalances. So what I also will say is mostly influenced by what academics call my research practice, or what some other people might just call public intellectual work, which is the work I've done with Africa as a Country, as Thandazani said, which has been around since 2009, and which has actively worked on these questions of representation and visibility. So so let me make my couple of quick points, and I won't be long. I think the first one, just by way of introduction, and we will send a kind of, I don't necessarily if it was a provocation or just some notes referring to Achille Mbembe's African modes of self-writing, in which he characterized one of the primary impulses by African writers, in his words, or in the summary, is that writers from Africa and the diaspora employ, in response to Western perceptions and formulations of the continent, what he terms Afro-radicalism, which is rooted in Marxism and nationalist ideologies that center Africa as being in a perpetual state of oppression and in need of liberation through socialism and revolution. Mbembe then sees nativism as the alternative approach. So it's either Afro-radicalism or nativism as kind of dead ends. And at some level, I would say that, you know, I agree with him that that's often the sort of the extreme posture. Those are the postures that is usually presented to us. But I also, I think one of the things that I'm going to suggest, maybe by way of talking about Africa as a Country, is that I don't think that that's always the case, that it doesn't have to be these extremes. And I think it is at odds with some of my own experiences if what we do is basically equates to public intellectual work. And I also think that in passing, his characterization of Afro-radicalism might apply more to what people now refer to mostly as Afro-pessimism, which is a kind of academic, mostly among academics, kind of started among academics here in the US, but now I think which is also catching up in Africa, and it seems to be very widespread now in South African universities. In my experience, however, I would argue that an Africa as a Country explicitly does phrase itself as Africa, if you want to call it African modes of self-writing from the left. I found that actually Marxists, or sometimes the more sort of cosmopolitan sections of left nationalist politics, are actually quite optimistic. In fact, they spend more of their energy is spent about reinventing the world every day. So there's I actually feel that there's always like an optimism to this kind of work. And there's a sort of confidence in the ability of ordinary people to change the world. So there's a rejection. I think what, and we don't have to enter into that as a long debate. I think what Mbembe was perhaps critiquing more is sort of state-centered politics, whereas I think social movement politics in Africa has been way more creative. Anybody who's paid attention, EndSARS, Walk to Work, some of the actions in Kenya, in South Africa, Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall, some of the work around Marikana, the reparations, the short-lived reparations movement in South Africa, reparations for apartheid. So I think there's a much more creative engagement with what is politically possible. So maybe in some parts of North American or Euro-American theory, there's a lot of pessimism about what is politically possible, and that might be because of sort of fallout from a hangover from liberation politics. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. And this goes to my second quick point, and I'll be very quick. I have two more points after this. The second quick point is, this refers to Renée's introduction, which is mostly for me about kind of in responding to that, what is our usable past? And I think what Africa as a country has done is to construct a lineage which is very dynamic. And I'll just mention this by specific reference to Africa as a country. If you think of public intellectual work that is always creative, always renewal, that always thinks about renewal. I've talked about this before, but for me, in thinking of Africa's country, then it's much more than just media criticism of like, how do we see us? The part that the lineage that it writes itself into, or that we work ourselves into, is that which I think starts in that first period of post-independence in the 1960s. In particular, a magazine that comes out of Kampala. It has very interesting politics, not so much with the content, but around funding. But I think Transition laid the groundwork for a sort of very open, robust discussion about politics that included people, Kwame Nkrumah, but also literary figures, so Yinka, some of the drum generation, Gordima, etc. It was a very vibrant space, a house with many rooms. And I think Africa as a country drew on that. I think secondly, for me specifically, I'm very much a product of the sort of 1980s, late 1980s in South Africa when I was in high school, and I then went to university. This is the era of, ironically, probably the most creative, most successful or robust period in South Africa when you think of producing magazines, like magazines, opinion magazines. So Staff Writer, Work in Progress, Die Suid-Afrikaan, this was an Afrikaans dual language, Afrikaans English magazine that appeared in South Africa at that period. These were magazines that produced reviews, political essays, commentary, film reviews, art reviews. I think that's sort of where Africa as a country draws on that kind of legacy. Thirdly, I think is the mass democratic politics of, and this is very specifically South African, the mass democratic politics of the United Democratic Front. I would say starting with the strikes in 1973, then the Soweto uprising, and then sort of its high point with the UDF in the 1980s. And the reason I mention this is the UDF, more than any other social movement in South Africa, also produced art, produced media, and had a very creative relationship with that art. And I think that is what Africa as a country draws on. And then finally, Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall. And I mentioned this because that's that thing of when I'm from a particular time and you can get stuck in your time, you can start only talking to the same people about politics, and having what happened in South Africa between 2015 and 2017 is very useful for not having this kind of like pessimistic view of politics and its relationship to creative culture. Thirdly, I just want to quickly read something which I think captures what Africa as a country tried to do in its response to either being very pessimistic, Mbembe's Afro-radicalism, or what he refers to as nativism. I think what we've tried to do is to say that you have to, and it sounds like a very obvious point, kind of trite, but I think it's quite powerful to repeat it, which is that to engage with Africa on its own terms. I think that's a very key point for me, and I think that relates to the reference that I always make is to an interview by the artist Maleko Mogosi, who is from Botswana originally, And he's done an interview, actually with Africa as a Country. He did an interview in which he talks about what he refers to as, when he talks about blackness, and he says that, I think the idea of blackness in the West and in the art historical narrative is really narrow. I think it is so narrow that it's actually kind of violent, because there's only one kind of blackness that is legible, and that is African-American blackness. There's no other kinds of blackness: African blackness, South African blackness, Brazilian blackness, Australian blackness, blackness in Eastern Europe. I'm thankful for the African-American blackness. Blackness is at least visible, and that there's a certain kind of gesture toward it. There's a certain kind of hope for the blackness that we want to deal with, that they might be legible at one point. It's a bit of a long quote, but he's just referring there to something that is much more complex, much more nuanced, and comes with variety. And I think the second quote, which I think is probably more relates to like Africa as a Country's approach to politics, which is that instead of a reactionary Pan-Africanist, I'm quoting him again, Pan-Africanist generalized conception of politics and Africa as a whole, I try to narrow my focus with specificity. The former, he means this kind of reactionary, more generalized politics, seem to always already essentialize and reduce complex histories and ideas into general statements. I have come to see this as violent, and I also think it produces a weak argument. So this kind of insistence on specificity, this insistence on dealing with real politics. And then finally, and I could say more about this maybe later if there's time for questions, I think finally, that's also how Africa as a Country, who Africa as a Country then features, what artists, what writers we feature. And by this, and I'm being sort of very general about this, and given what I just said, is that we like to feature people who dare to invent the future while dealing and confronting the legacies of neoliberalism, the adverse effects of globalization, and crucially, and this I think is the crucial part, the fallout from independence politics. And so that for us, in our work, we want to underscore the agency of people themselves, to imagine alternatives, to craft and debate strategies for emancipation, and to advance critiques against the status quo. I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, Sean. Chikukwa, we invite your comments.
Thank you very much, Renée, and thank you, Thandazani. Thank you, Koyo, and your team for inviting me to be part of this important conversation, which I think refusing the gaze and seeing and authoring ourselves, which is very, very important to the current discussions that are happening across the continent and the diaspora. I think for me, the conversations that had started way back in the 60s from the Harlem in My Mind in New York, and also many others which were inspired by the Black Panther and the Pan-African African politicians, from Kwame Nkrumah to many others, to Thomas Sankara, are kind of very, very informing to my own practice. And also being at the National Gallery, where looking at the archive and the work that we've been doing and the work that was done by our founding director, Frank McEwen, is very, very kind of inspiring to the current practice that we do here at the National Gallery, and especially myself, looking at when I arrived at the National Gallery and say, what can we make out of what has been made before? And I would also want to go back to what Renée also talked about earlier on, the formula of remembrance, and which pasts must we remember. And looking at the events that have taken place in South Africa, the roads must fall and the fees must fall, and also to question what happens when monuments die, because the roads must fall. That has sparked a lot of controversy that also later on, after the death of Floyd in America, that also managed to topple a number of colonial monuments in America and in Europe and in the United Kingdom. What can we say, and how do we see ourselves currently with the exhibition that we that is just ended at the 𝙒𝙗𝙗 that is also trying to question how we look at ourselves as Africans, because I think, in my own perspective, we have remained passengers in our own ship for too long, and it is important for us to be able to tell our own stories. But these conversations also started way back with those that came before us. Our contribution and my contribution has also been looking at Zimbabwe as a country that gained independence about 40-something years ago. And we're a very young country. And looking at the projects like the first Zimbabwe pavilion at the Venice Biennale, which was entitled Seeing Ourselves, questioning the geographical landscape and the space we occupy from yesterday, today, and tomorrow. That exhibition was kind of an idea of questioning the, Sean's ideas of the Africa as a country, because the representation of the exhibition that was put together by both Simon Jami and Fernanda Vim, which was the African Pavilion, was something which really sparked the ideas of saying Africa is not a country. Africa is one of the largest continents on earth, and so we gave birth to the Zimbabwe Pavilion in order to respond to the idea of saying Africa is one of the largest continents on earth, and how does an African country represent itself? And we have seen many exhibitions that have taken place in Europe, most of them about Africa, but those exhibitions have never seen the light of the day in the continent. And since 2011, and I'm sure South Africa was also part of the Venice Biennale, and many other African countries later on joined to become, to represent themselves and seeing themselves at the one of the global art stages, which is very, very important. And also looking at it from a perspective and say, you have very small countries who have country pavilions. So why can't we have our own to speak for ourselves and to also add our voice and to claim the piece of the cake that the Venice platform provides to the rest of the global world? But the most important thing, which I also think is which we need to think about here, is the perceptions that the global West and possibly even Asia have about Africa. How do we come in as African artists, scholars, curators, and also African art institutions? That is a good example, the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, and including the 𝙒𝙗𝙗𝙦 itself and many other art institutions within the continent. How do we really come out with exhibitions that are very provocative, that are also questioning the ideas of self and self-reflection, which I think for a number of years, a number of African institutions, we have been waiting for those that want to remain our teachers to be able to bring those exhibitions to us, and also to take those exhibitions into the international community. And a number of those have happened since the Magician de la Terre and the Africa 95, which was in London, and many others. But the number of diaspora curators have also challenged a number of those exhibitions that give birth to a number of exhibitions that were curated by both Okwi, Simon Jami, Salah Hassan, Jelan Tawandros, to mention but a few. But I would also want to say the arrival of a number of female curators, or let's say curators who I respect so much, by challenging the diaspora curators that in the past they've always thought that Africa has got no capacity to do it. And here I would like to mention the likes of Koyo herself, the late B.C. Silva, who really was kind of one of the figures, including 𝘞𝘩𝘢𝘵 and Maskerem in Addis, Marilyn Douala from Douala. They took the lead as these, let me be very blunt and say, these girls, they showed us a way. And it was one of the main reasons why, when I was based in the UK, after the conversations between myself and the late BC, to say there's a possibility to be able to tell our own stories. There's a possibility that Africa can speak from the continent and also be heard from the continent. And the African audience has been starved of the representation of their own artists in their own backyard. And I think since then, I'm sure the Raw Material Company in Senegal, when they initiated another conversation, which I'm sure many, it was about the role of institutions in Africa. It also sparked a lot of conversations that today we are still battling with, in order for us to also define the role of art institutions in Africa. And I'm sure there's a need for us to continue to interrogate the role of institutions in Africa. For we are an institution that is run and funded by government, and but I think our role and function is to continuously evolve in order for us to be relevant in the current practice and in the current discussions that are taking place around the globe. And I would also want to thank the 𝘂𝙬𝙗 for the collaboration that we have started a number of years, that has seen some of the work from the permanent collection being showcased at the exhibition that is going to tour to Switzerland. And I know that it's not very easy to move artworks between the continent, and but this new possibility is something which, if we are going to see ourselves and continue to author ourselves, this is a new beginning for us to be able to explore that. And as National Gallery of Zimbabwe, I'm sure we've done kind of collaborations with Kampala, we've done collaborations especially with the 𝘂𝙬𝙗, but as a newly established art institution, it has given us possibilities that can be done within the continent. And I think one of the provocations that we need to discuss about is the possibilities that can make us relevant as art institutions in the continent, and the collaborations that we need to think about that can see our artists crisscrossing within the continent, because we meet more in Europe than we meet in Africa. And that's one question which we need to deal with. And I know that South Africa, especially Johannesburg, is just a stone throw from Zimbabwe. But how many South African artists have been to Zimbabwe? That's $1 million question. And how many of those artists within Africa have traveled within the continent? And as much as we can talk about seeing ourselves, but let's also think about seeing ourselves in the continent. And I was saying this last week in Ljubljana in Slovenia to a number of Ghanaian artists, that the relationship that was created during the non-aligned movement and the cultural projects that emanated from the non-aligned movement is something which the Yugoslavia are part of the Yugoslavia countries are actually exploring at the moment. But if it's coming from those countries, there's need for us to be able to look at it, because our founding fathers from Senghor, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and many others, their dreams and aspirations, including Mzee Julius Nyerere and Kenneth Kaunda. I was saying to my colleagues in Ljubljana, those Ghanaians, to say, those that came before us were ahead of their time. They used to meet more often than we are today, given that today we have got, maybe the social media is actually depriving that opportunity to meet in person, because we meet in this virtual world, and how much can be realized within the virtual world, and how much can be realized what was realized by those that came before us, especially the Pan-African, the nationalists, who I'm sure their meetings, both at the AU, both in their respective countries, gave us what we are today. So I think from there, I think there's a need for us to revisit what these guys dreamt of, and take advantage of the archives that are dotted around the world, take advantage of the archives that are dotted within the continent, because I was looking at the archive and look at the Black Orpheus magazine that was founded by Frank McEwen, Wole Soyinka, Senghor, and Cesar. And if you think about that magazine that was founded many years ago, very few copies are around. So we can drink from that pot and be able to inspire the future. I think I would want to end there so much that at least we can give time to discuss more about the new possibilities and old possibilities that were there, and also to think about the formula of remembrance, which I'm sure Renée touched about, and which past must we remember as a people, and the idea and the process of unlearning today in this digital era. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chikukwa. Thank you, Sean. Thank you to whoever is sending hearts in the Q&A. That's very sweet. If you also would like to send questions, this is a critical time. Yeah, I think I would just potentially like to pick up on the point that Chikukwa ended on right there, to do with circulation, to do with like also different constituencies, right? That we're thinking very much about Africa. And I'm always really curious about this mythology of Africa, because it's one that we have for a long time resisted, but in some respects, and I think, Sean, you can speak to this, there is some acceptance of this mythology and this acknowledgement that there is a way that we, in some respects, speak as a single body or from a single lineage, right? We have similar references, and we make very our priorities in terms of like who we cite and which movements we follow, which legacies we follow, are very much compatible. So I'm interested, and I know, Sean, you've already warned us, of course, against the violence of generalizing and the importance of specificity, which I think is one of the reasons why an exhibition like When We See Us really kind of like highlights individuality and individual position within the African continent. So yeah, I'm interested in this idea, this mythology of Africa, and how it has sustained or changed for both of you in your practices. Chikukwa, as you travel back and forth between Venice these past couple of years, and of course that's not the only place that the Zimbabwe Pavilion travels or iterations of the Zimbabwe Pavilion travels, but like, yeah, I assume that the conversations between these different ports are constantly shifting. But also, I think it's significant that we consider the mythology of diaspora, because especially in these last couple of years, the different exhibitions that we've had that I think kind of in themselves exist on a planetary scale. Sean, I think you mentioned Festac 77, and, you know, like all of these different movements that have sought to sort of like re-articulate the position of African diasporas and continental Africans, and how these parties should be, in some respects, united. I live in Rwanda, and we're having a lot of conversations in the last couple of years, as it is a couple of years since the year of return was declared, and we have a huge diaspora community there that is interacting with a Central African nation that was for very many years in the pre-colonial period, in the colonial period, but also in the immediate post-colonial period, was isolated by various different circumstances, the structure of the kingdoms, the difficulty of travel, but then also critically by the situation of war. So diaspora and this idea of repatriation for us is very new, and you can see kind of like very positive relationships, but also quite fraught situations between so-called diasporic communities and local communities. So yeah, we have all these different positions. The first question I would like to kind of throw out there is to do with this mythology of Africa and the mythology of diaspora. But second, because I know, Sean, you would like to leave, and just so that you have this in mind, I'm also quite interested in this idea of building an archive as a way of projecting into the future, projecting a future possibility. So in some respect, we are all performing ourselves as somebody's ancestor, hopefully a good ancestor. I hope to be a generous and benevolent ancestor, but this is not guaranteed. So I wonder which are the critical strategies that both of you adopt in your various institutions, in your various interactions, collaborations, that you feel are more secure than others in creating these future possibilities. I don't know that at FESTAC or at Présence Africaine or at all of these institutions of the past, that they really thought of themselves as something that would be discussed in 2023 in the ways that it is, or like such critical references. So I wonder what strategies are urgent for you at this moment. Thank you.
I mean, I can go quickly. I mean, initially, Africa as a country started as a media criticism. So it's important to make that distinction. Its intent in the beginning was to respond to, I was in New York at the time, this is after 9/11, the sort of major or the main ways that people talked about Africa was, lack of, or war on terror. So this was development economics, humanitarianism. And so my reaction in starting Africa as a country, not with the intent, as you said, I don't know what kind of ancestor I'm going to be, but my intent was to just respond to that kind of, sort of flattened out depiction and representation of Africa. And again, not at no point, at that point, I don't think we thought about, well, me, that I am speaking for a continent, or I was just sort of imagining myself. I'm in New York, I'm responding to kind of the sort of mainline American media, the ones that set the news agenda, the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, and how they talk about Africa. So that was the initial idea. I think what happened was, so it was less about defining ourselves. Initially, it was mostly defining ourselves in opposition to something else. And then the internet kind of sped up and changed the relationship of that kind of writing. So you had Twitter and Facebook. So anybody could now, if they saw an egregious example of reporting or representation, they could in real time respond to those, using their Facebook page, using their Twitter. So that meant that something like Africa as a country, if it wanted to, and that's why I'm saying something that has always been with Africa's country, is this question of renewal, this question of always thinking about its own positionality, who's there, who are we trying to represent, how are we engaging with the people that we're writing about, etc. So when that happened, Africa as a country, I think, realized that what it might want to do is to become much more of a sort of opinion or analysis magazine. And so my point the third point which I made in those opening remarks I made, which is I realized that, actually, it's not, I wasn't inventing something new, that there is to get to your point of ancestors, there is a long history on the African continent, specifically, of course, in the diaspora, to Présence Africaine out of Paris. There's, transition at various points actually ended up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. After Uganda, it was revived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I think it's still there. But the thing is, like, the initial impetus for it was that sort of post-independence Africa, and actually very optimistic, not unrealistic, but optimistic about what the task was. So that second impulse then, so firstly reacting, the second impulse was, oh, we could potentially play a different role, and we're not going to reinvent the wheel because there's a long tradition that we could draw on. I mentioned this transition one, the South African one. I don't think we've always said that we don't take the responsibility to speak for. I think we're very aware of it. And I want to make one other quick point. Initially, there was an imbalance on this question of what is Africa, who is Africa in this sort of online culture. There was an imbalance where most of the writers initially lived outside Africa. I mean, I live in New York City. Most of these people worked in or studied in American universities or European universities. So that imbalance was there. It was only as they developed also on the continent, like local newspapers kind of picked up on online. They picked up on their own online versions. There was a very creative engagement that young people started to have with the internet. Literary magazines developed on the continent. So that changed. And if you look at Africa as a country now, you'll notice that there's a much more there's a better balance between those people who live outside and those people who live on the continent. And again, there's no like valuing like who's more important. I do think it is important when you say I'm engaging with a real place that you actually have to engage with what's going on there rather than sort of like discourses that you're forming in the diaspora. And my last quick point is this. Right now, we're actually working on a project called New African Intellectuals. And what we're trying to do is to deliberately empower young writers, creators who live on the continent, mostly, to produce media, not as a fellow. We're not trying to just have somebody come in, work with us for like a year, write a few articles for us, and then they're off. No, we're actually trying to set them up so that they could produce media by themselves, even start their own project, podcasts, films, writing. And initially, there's a kind of an agreement that they publish with us. But if they want to produce something on their own platform, if they want to produce it for mainstream publications, whether in Africa or in Europe or North America or in South Asia or East Asia or wherever, Latin America, they should be able to do that. And then I think the last one is we're also well aware that in imagining sort of more creative futures for Africans, what we often do is like, and that's why I actually agree with Mbembe, is that we do construct ourselves mostly in the vision of the West. And one of the things we are actively working on is let's look to places where people have experimented with politics, if you want, of a better life. And we find that that's been happening a lot in South America, in South and Central America, like in Colombia, in Brazil, where you are currently. I mean, I think that there's way more creative ways that people have thought about, not just their material needs, but also creatively, like how do you engage with technology? How do you engage with whatever artistic medium or so on? So I feel like that's how we are trying to I'm sort of giving a long kind of, I don't know, a long answer here, but that's basically my response to that conundrum. Like what does it mean to be African now, almost, if you want? Like how would we see Africans now? I think that's our approach to it. It's to be creative, to be kind of nimble about it, and not to get too stuck. Of course, like I said, we are aware of a usable past, that there are things we can draw on, that we can build on. But we are not. We're less stuck in sort of getting too fixed in it, or to rely on sort of like what is currently being presented in the mainstream. So yeah, we engage with Black Panther, we engage with Afrobeats, sorry, like all these kind of cultural trends that are going on. We interview young artists. I think there's a great series on the website where Drew Forrest interviews like Maleko, what's her name? The young South African artist, Michael Armitage. Like, like, so the site does that. It wants to do those things, but it's also aware that there's a lot of creativity that we may not pick up on if we just stay within this frame of like what circulates between us and the West. Anyway, I can go on, but I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, Sean. Chikukwa, can I invite you to comment on the same? This idea that there is a mythology of Africa and a mythology of the diaspora, but then also that we are collectively or individually building strategies to project like a better future. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Sean. And I'm sure it is very important for us to be able to think about a better future, and to think about a future that those that will come after us will be able to dig deeper and have an understanding of our journeys, and have an understanding of where they will be going. And for us, especially here, our strategy and our intent as National Gallery of Zimbabwe is also to look at both the archive that we have here in Africa, and especially in Zimbabwe. And because Zimbabwe, since the founding of the National Gallery, it has never been isolated. Yes, it was isolated during the UN sanctions in the 1960s, but the communication between Zimbabwe and the rest of the continent has always been open because of the Pan-Africanists, their communication from Algiers to Egypt to Tanzania to Mozambique to Zambia and to South Africa. So that archive does inform what we are doing. And I would want to go back to the Zimbabwean scholars that started writing in our own language. And these are the likes of the first Black lawyer in Rhodesia, who was none other than 𝘱𝙬𝘺, who wrote a poem which was called Sokorisina Msoro, which I'm sure we presented to one of the Venice Biennale in Venice. But you also have the likes of Solomon Mshairo, who wrote Neanda Nyakasikana, the famous poem that inspired the liberators back here during the Rhodesian era. And Solomon Mshairo went on to write a book called Feso. And you also have the likes of Bernard Chidzero, who wrote a book entitled Chinzvenga Mshairo. And the question here is basically why most of these, they were scholars who went to Harvard, who went to Oxford University, and why did they write in their own language? And I'm sure the rest of the continent will still suffer from, and here we are conversing, and we are all Africans, we are conversing in the colonial language. When your language is taken, your culture is taken. And those are some of the questions that we need to confront ourselves with. And that's what here at the National Gallery, we are trying to do that, and to also work with artists, because the African writers that started rethinking in their own language is something which is very, very interesting today, in a sense that when you look at the exhibition, when we see ourselves, but when we see ourselves in the visual language, but we also need to see ourselves in our own language, which I think is very, very important. And I would also want to say the lessons from Tanzania is very, very important to the rest of the continent. I know that Kiswahili has been pronounced as the AU language, but how do we translate that in the visual language? How do we, and our artists are also challenging us. And I know that a number of artists, they now title their work in their own language, the likes of Nicholas Lobo and Virginia Chiwota and many others, which I think it's like you said earlier on, we need to unlearn ourselves, but we can only unlearn ourselves in rethinking in our own language. which I think is very, very important. But one of the most important things which we also need to ask ourselves is the idea of repatriation and restitution that has opened a can of worms within the Western metropolis, which I think it is very important for us to think about this subject. And when we are talking about repatriation, what are we repatriating to the continent? Because we do have human remains, archives, and objects that are dotted around. And here I want to touch about the Zimbabwean scholars whose archive is possibly in America. Some of those manuscripts which were written by the likes of 𝘞𝘩𝘢𝘐𝙑 and Bernard Chidzero and many others. But I'm sure there is a need for us to look at it from a perspective to say, as scholars today, what is our role, and where do we stretch ourselves to in order for us to see ourselves? And
Chikukwa, sorry, let me stop you on that point.
Yes.
I think we have to excuse Sean, but you and I are free to continue for a few minutes. Thank you so much, Sean. It's been such a pleasure, and thank you for the references. The folks in the question and answer segment send thanks. Many people are saying thank you, Sean. So thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Sean.
Sorry to interrupt you. Please continue, Chikukwa. You were speaking. Yes, about this really critical legacy.
Well, I mean, the like you said earlier on, what do we, for me, the subject of repatriation and restitution and the idea of seeing ourselves, you can only see yourself and celebrate yourself in the continent. And that is very, very critical. And the events that have taken place after the call by the French president about celebrating Africa in Africa, it's exactly what has happened with the exhibition at 𝘒𝙬𝙗, that we are now realizing and celebrating Africa in Africa, which is very, very important. And it is my wish that other institutions across the continent, we need to also take a leaf out of this and look at the possibilities and unlock the challenges that are there in the mobility of both artists within the continent, both artworks and objects within the continent, because I'm sure that's where our challenge is. That's why it is very difficult as well to travel exhibitions within the continent. And if we can take a leaf out of the events that have taken place at the 𝘒𝙬𝙗, which is a very young institution, and that has given us an opportunity to be able to look at this exhibition that has brought African figuration into the city of Cape Town. But not only that, but having it to be birthed in Africa and to also be able to travel into the Western metropolis. It's very, very important. And I'm sure we are retaining the gaze instead of we are actually refusing the gaze by so doing. And I think from here I can take any questions.
Oh, thank you very much. That's certainly a lot to think about. And I think this question of restitution in particular is really, really expansive. And we've seen so many different approaches from different contexts within the continent, but also like all over the world, of course, as to the question of restitution. I think that there is an interesting distinction, and Sean also mentioned potentially that restitution can be many things, but he quoted 𝘱𝘢𝑗𝑜 Ngumo, who speaks about that when, and many people of course have spoken on this, that when these objects, mostly objects in this respect, are brought back to our national institutions and like are repatriated to the continent, one critical question is how they're treated, right? And of course, there is always there is always the conflict between like how we treat people versus how we treat ideas and objects. And in many respects, I think it's important to note that restitution is a question of justice before it is a question of things, right? Of objects, of items. But I wonder how an institution like the National Gallery, that was conceptualized first almost 100 years ago in the 1930s, thinks about the question of restitution, fitting in within this legacy that is rather complicated in many respects. It is unlike many sort of like post-colonial institutions in that it was very much created, like I think you always say, Chikukwa, you always talk about like this was created for a chosen few, for like a very specific demographic. And at some point outside of the National Gallery, there was a very clear mandate that it was a whites-only institution. So yeah, I wonder, like in that respect, because the National Gallery, as a result of this very difficult legacy, has much of the legacy of what is now modern Zimbabwe intact, right? Like a lot of the stuff that belongs to these heritages within Zimbabwe, but also within the region of Southern East Africa are intact within the gallery. So I wonder what this question means for you. And I think it's also very critical what you spoke about earlier about vocabulary, that we really have to kind of reclaim the vocabulary around how we speak about ourselves and also develop new vocabularies to sort of reassert our position when speaking back to this Western framing of ourselves and in opposing this gaze. Yeah, so yeah, please, if you can expound a little bit on that.
I'm sure one thing we must understand is that cultural rights are human rights too. And it is very unfortunate that there is a tendency in the West that when we return these objects, the Africans will not be able to look after them, or they will be stolen. But I'm sure the events that have taken place at the British Museum shows that when you steal somebody's property, it can also be stolen in your own backyard. And those who always say that when we take these objects back to Africa, I see it as a colonial excuse. And it can only come from born-again colonialists. And without being apologetic and without being allergic to history, we know that Africa's past and the Western world is a very painful and traumatic past, that it is up to the West to be able to repair the colonial wounds that have been inflicted to the African people and to the African cultures. I'm sure we were in Dakar early this year when we were discussing about the inventories that are within the museums in the West. And today those inventories, they're irrelevant because remember, they carry narratives by the so-called collectors or looters. And if you go to the British Museum or to any museum, be it in Germany or in France or in America, if you look in their inventories, they don't speak. Some of these, they were religious objects. They were, they are objects of a particular culture and a particular people, and they meant a lot from those people. But today, the interpretation that we have in those inventories, if you ask a Yoruba or a Maasai person or a Ndebele or a Tonga person, you bring them that object, they will translate or give you another interpretation of that object. But yet, the interpretation or with which has been given it in that inventory does not mean anything to people of its origins. So there is a trauma that those objects carry today. And I'm sure we've been apologetic for too long as Africans. And we listen and hear to the so-called specialists from the West, who today they don't even speak the same language. But why are we interested as National Gallery for repatriation? Because our artists when they want to research on these objects, when they want to research on the archive, they have to declare their relatives, cats and dogs, including their ancestors who died 200 years ago, just for them to get a visa. Even when they get a visa to go to the Western metropolis, trying to access the archive, be it in Paris, in London, in New York, they also have to declare their parents, relatives, cats and dogs for them to access those archives in order for them to bring them to another life. So that is very, very critical for us to think about. And it is important for the Western communities to look at how they can heal the colonial wounds. And if these objects and archives and human remains are here in the continent, like I know that the Germans have repatriated the Nama and the Herero human remains, but not all, which are now in the in Namibia. But it is now up to the Namibian people to be able to give them back to the people or the Nama and the Herero people, so much that they can rebury or give them a decent burial of their ancestors. So there's a need for us to be able to do these processes, but within some of the objects that today a lot of artists, and I can mention the artists like Tapfuma and many others, who are really very, very much interested in trying to research on these objects. But how do they get to those Western metro before you even think about the ticket, before you even think about the visa? So those are some of the challenges. So if these objects are brought back into the continent, we can be able to celebrate Africa within the continent. And I'm sure this is very important for those that have these objects to understand that they purport to preach about human rights, and yet they cannot even live and give us the right to our cultural objects and our human remains and our archives that are very, very important in order for us to inform the future using these archives, because they're very important to the African people. And that's in my thinking, and looking at, as much as we are not the National Museum and Monuments, but we also share the same sentiments with the National Museum and Monuments and many other museums that are dotted around we do have a small anthropological collection and objects. Some of them were bought and some of them were donated when the International Congress on African Cultures took place. But we also need to think about the inter-Africa repatriation as one of the key subjects, because we know that one of the great Zimbabwe bird is still in South Africa. So, but the most important thing, most of these objects are more in the Western world than they are in the continent.
Oh, that's a very interesting point that you speak about this inter-African repatriation. Honestly, I don't think that I've ever considered this, but of course, there is like a strange overlap between this ideal of Pan-Africanism and trans-temporality versus just a simple question of justice. And in many respects, like, I think my initial question is Zimbabwe not South Africa and South Africa not Zimbabwe? Like, we are siblings. So is it so far that that we travel to South Africa to see these Zimbabwean objects, or we travel to Egypt to see these Mauritanian objects, or that? Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, as we also like are always constantly challenging the notion of borders within the continent and the notion that our mobility is limited, or that our mobility is challenged, and that we are only able to move in very privileged circles. And I think both of you are part of this privilege, no? That we are able to meet in Uganda or in Algeria or in Dakar. There is a question in the question Q&A box about seeing how our collective practices as in some respects like makers of stories, right? Like imaginative practices that include storytelling, filmmaking, exhibition making, how we might imagine the notion of seeing ourselves. Like, what for you is a vision of oneself that is finally has us arriving to that point of justice. For you as a curator and as an exhibition maker, as a maker of publications and really brilliant conversations, but then also like as a citizen, like what is it for you to see yourself on the continent as an African? Like what is a point at which the seeing of yourself is sort of removed from this colonial violence that you mentioned earlier? Like, yeah, where is the point of healing? At what point are you satisfied?
I'm sure the idea of being able to tell my own story, because remember, our stories have been told by those that want to remain our teachers for many years. And I'll go back to the first Zimbabwe pavilion, which was entitled Seeing Ourselves, questioning the geographical landscape of the space we occupy from yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And also looking at the issue of language, because I'm sure as a British colony in the past, we've been robbed of our language, we've been robbed of our names, we've been robbed of our heritage, we've been robbed of our so many things that today I know that many people know me as Raphael Chikukwa. That's a colonial name, because the idea of being born in a mission hospital was something which was many of Zimbabweans today. It's only now we're trying to, the new generation has gone back naming children with our original names, which in the past, it was purported to be, those names were evil. So I'm sure the new generation, I can see myself in that. And, but I'm sure there's more that we can do. And we can only see ourselves through exhibition making, through filmmaking, and the films that can reflect about who we are as a people. And that process alone, it's not an event. And I've always said to people, this is like a marathon. We have to go pole pole. Otherwise, as they say in Swahili, that haraka haraka hina baraka. It will not be possible. Let's not treat this as a short relay. It is a marathon. So we have to go pole pole in order for us to be able to do the best out of seeing ourselves and telling our own stories. And it's not an overnight event. It will take time, but every generation that comes and those scholars that came before us during the colonial era, were able to do it under the colonial yoke. And Africa is now fully independent, but we're still not independent because we still communicate. And this conversation we are having, we should have been having the conversation possibly in Kiswahili or in Zulu, in order for us to be able to express ourselves. Because if you go to the Russians, if you go to the Chinese, they converse in their own language. But here we are in the continent, it's either we're doing it in French or in Portuguese or in English. So we are not seeing ourselves. So that process alone is a process that people like Ngugi had already started by refusing to write in English, by refusing to be understood in that language, so much that at least their writing can be translated in that language. So it's a marathon, let me say that.
Thank you for this final reflection. I'm so grateful, Chikukwa and Sean in his absence. I'm so grateful to have been able to speak with both of you today. Thank you so much to 𝙒𝙗𝙗 for this kind invitation. Thank you, Tato, Goyo, Dandazan, Yvonne, everybody that's been involved with this process. I want to challenge you a little bit, Chikukwa, on that final point. We speak in English, we speak in Portuguese, we speak in French. We really suffered to learn these languages. And for me, like I would like to expel my suffering by making the best use of this language, by abusing it, by using it well, by using it to travel and to I don't know, uplift many as efficiently as possible. I think I don't know that we will ever be privileged to speak as many languages as our ancestors did. Hopefully this is something that we can project into a better future, a strategy, a decolonial strategy that applies and benefits all of us. But for now, we really have suffered a lot. I know you did in your Zimbabwean schools, and I certainly did in Kenya. So yeah, I think we are entitled to appropriate these positions and to exploit these positions, and for free, actually, mind you, for free. So I would like to invite Thandazani back to help us wrap up here. And thank you so much. Again, Chikukwa, thank you to everybody on the team for this kind invitation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Raphael, Sean, and Renee, for this very robust and insightful conversation. This discussion on refusing the gaze, seeing and authoring ourselves, was a great way to end our When We See Us webinar series. Over 10 episodes or series from March 2022 to September 2023, the webinars have unpacked a wide range of topics, which expounded on Black subjectivities, Africaneity, Black consciousness, and amongst many other topics. Our webinar presenters included many amazing people, including artists, curators, scholars, writers, and activists. And I would like to take this moment to thank every single one of them, and every single person who's contributed to this last year and a half of a webinar series. And a special thank you also to our collaborators, 𝘞𝘢𝘢 UCT. For more information, to access today's talk and other programming, feel free to follow us on our social media channels for future updates. And once again, a good evening or an afternoon, depending on where you are dialing in from. And thank you so much once again, everyone.